110. Anyone say 110? It's standing at $100, sold right down front of the $100 bill. Now, the next three, ladies and gentlemen, are special Quebec ducks, I understand. Little different style, small. I don't know whether you call those pintails or not. I'm not up in my ducks like I should be, except on the table on a platter. But we'll sell the black duck and something a little different. Anyone say $150 for the black duck? $150. Anyone start? What's the bid, ma'am? $150. Thank you very much. We open at $150. Shall we say $200 for this one? Two on this front corner and $250. $250's bidding $300. $300 in the back row and $350. Three and a half. Shall we say now $400? Would you round it off at $4? $375. Thank you. And a $400 in this corner. Would you make it $4? $400 up front and $425. Would you go the 5 and $425 and $450? $450 in the back row. Thank you. $475 and $500. Shall we say the 5? Would you make it $500 even?
That's the sound of a busy auctioneer. Now, he's not selling priceless antique furniture or rare old masterpieces. What he's selling is simple carved wooden birds like this one, waterfowl decoys. Now, when you consider that the man who carved this sort of bird might have sold them for, say, $3 a dozen to a hunter or to a market gunner, and that in there, birds are selling individually for thousands of dollars, you begin to realize the value that has come to these examples of an original Canadian folk art. You could say that original Canadian folk art had mythical beginnings, for there was a time on this continent, long before the arrival of Europeans, when the wildlife of land and sea and air flourished in such numbers as to be the stuff of legend and myth, a profusion of life almost beyond our comprehension today. But if the first explorers of a new land saw nature as something to be conquered and exploited, things were a little different for the native people who lived here. Wildlife meant food, food meant survival. Somewhere in a marsh, perhaps in many marshes scattered across this earth, native hunters created the first simple decoys from materials at hand, from reeds, grasses, twigs, and mud, to make a silhouette, a shape on the water. These decoys from a cave in Nevada are 1,000 years old. The decoy was a tool, nothing more. But even then, some showed signs of the elegance and art which would surely follow. Nowhere else on Earth were the flyways so densely packed with migrating waterfowl as here in North America. Twice a year, they flew in great rivers of life up and down the length of a continent. For the waiting settlers and colonists, they were irresistible targets. Besides food for the table, there was money to be made from what seemed like a never-ending supply of wild birds. The market gunners went to work. In the fall of 1883, one group of hunters from Winnipeg killed and sold more than 11,000 ducks. And figures like this were common. The myth of superabundance said that the wildlife resources of this continent were limitless. Ducks, shorebirds, songbirds, seabirds, few escaped this period of excess. And millions of birds were killed not only for the table, but for their feathers, which would adorn women's hats. Slowly, a continent came to its senses, but too late for birds like the Eskimo curlew or the passenger pigeon or the Labrador duck. Organized sportsmen's clubs in the United States and Canada argued for controls before it was too late, before more species were wiped out. The myth of superabundance was being exposed. It was during the period of intensive and uncontrolled hunting that the wooden decoy, the block as it was known, came into its own, and indeed it worked almost too well. Wherever there were ducks or herons or shorebirds or cranes or other species being shot, there were carvers producing decoys, which would be highly valued years later. Who would have guessed that a pair of canvas-back decoys carved around the turn of the century would sell in 1986 for $93,000. With the growth of the clubs, the guides became the carvers. Some of the blocks were roughly shaped, just enough to bring in a duck. Some would be true works of art. So the decoys that now are so treasured have had a bittersweet history. They played a role in a period of hunting that no one today is too proud of, and survived themselves as a distinct and uniquely North American art form. It wasn't easy to regulate the killing of wild birds which flew across national, provincial, and state boundaries of both North and South America, but something had to be done. In Canada and the United States, private citizens and a few dedicated civil servants worked hard for a solution. And finally, in 1918, an historic treaty between our two countries would control and bring order to the hunting of migratory birds. In the years that followed, hunting clubs and conservation groups would also draw public attention to the damage being done to waterfowl habitat by agriculture and industrialization, as the great marshes of North America were steadily drained and filled in. A New York foundation spelled out the problem. In the 1930s, Ducks Unlimited was formed. Now we also have Habitat Canada. Their common purpose is to restore shrinking habitats wherever they can. Artists have always loved to paint scenes which feature the grace and beauty of waterfowl. Now, the old wooden decoy is taking its place beside the works of wildlife artists. Today, duck hunting is subject to many more controls than in the past. The marshes of Long Point on Lake Erie are a vital staging area for migrating waterfowl.
The Long Point is 32 kilometers long, and there must be about up to 10,000 birds out there today.
I've been shooting down here for approximately 25 years, off and on. Take both seasons. I take the pre-season, good weather. I come down later on, ice up, freeze up. I finish shooting my duck season down here.
Before 1961, when a waterfowl unit was formed, there used to be uncontrolled hunting, and there'd be a lot of hunters out there and many blinds, and there'd be conflicts between the hunters and the in different areas fighting over the lines.
Pressure on hunting it was all locals here. But then as the ministry started, they also started a feeding program. And the ministry blocks in 2 areas down here. It is controlled, and it's a good thing. It produces more hunting for other people, outside people. And because of the feeding program, I think we started a stronger flyway.
started in 1961, and they had something like 60 blinds. They rented out, and the hunters would come in early in the morning, pay for their blind rental, and receive 8 decoys and a map and send out to the area.
If you are a duck hunter, you'll know what I'm saying, is the wooden decoys seem to work better, more natural in the water. And May of the Seas, they call it, rough down here, white caps, they'll hold their own, where the plastic have a tendency to flare, and because of being plastic and artificially painted, they have a shine, and the ducks will flare, it's calling, like blind shy or flare from that plastic shine. But again, too, they are heavier, and if you are walking in the blinds and carrying, the plastic is the way to go. You have to pick your day for your decoy.
As people continue to collect the works of waterfowl carvers, the original wooden decoys in places like Long Point have all but disappeared. They are simply too valuable to shoot over. But collectors know that some of those old decoys are still squirreled away around here in basements and attics.
I wish I could get my hands on some of them that they used to give us. People have hidden them anywhere and everywhere.
The art of the decoy carver has gone far beyond the plain shooting block, with finely etched detail and meticulous painting. They've come a long way from the native hunter's functional design of reeds and twigs and grasses. These birds will never see a marsh or hear the sound of a gun. They will hear the comments of judges or the chant of an auctioneer. If you were looking for some old-timers who can tell stories of carvers whose names are now famous, you might come to a place like this, a quiet little town along the shores of a lake or close to a marsh and wetland, a place where families live near water and there's been a tradition of guiding and carving. Collectors know this, and so do today's new generation of carvers. That's what brings Al Brady here to Port Rowan on Lake Erie's North Shore. He's a professional carver, and he makes a living at it. He's also a student of the waterfowl carving traditions of North America. His own work comes directly from those traditions. There are families here, for example, that can add to his own knowledge and perhaps influence his approach to carving. It's also still true that where there are ducks flying, there are carvers watching and studying. Sometimes private ownership of wild lands has been a blessing for wildlife. The Long Point Company, which owned most of these vital marshes for more than 100 years, saved them from the perils of public ownership, which surely would have brought intense development to the beaches and sand dunes. It was here, too, in the 1870s that Phineas Reeves began a family tradition of carving wooden decoys. And there was John and Charles and Jack Reeves, all working as punters, guides, and carvers for the Long Point Company. Their decoys had a family style recognized today, and many were preserved by club members. Jack Reeves remembers.
The boys were always at the point, my father and so on. So he went over there to guide, my grandfather, one of the first ones in 1866. And he guided there for, I guess, until he died, 1980 or 89 or something like that. By that time, his two sons, Frank and Charlie, were punting there. That was my father and my uncle. And my father punted there 50 years, and I overlapped on him, and I was there 45 years. So that takes it back to the beginning of the Long Point Company.
Today, hunting by members of the company is fairly limited, and they've donated over 6,000 acres of marshes to the protective custody of the Canadian Wildlife Service. Jack Reeves also remembers carving decoys right here in the marsh.
In making decoys, I don't know, they weren't always exactly like the bird. But as my father said, you have to sacrifice something for something else. You want them so they were seaworthy, so they dried, and they had their heads higher than they should be. But that was to keep the ice from forming on the bill and having them dip. And so you had to sacrifice one thing for another, you know. But, and as far as painting goes, well, I just get the overall color. We didn't go for any fancy decorations because that wasn't necessary.
The Reeves draw knife, handed on from one generation to another.
Oh, it's just a knife that belonged to my grandfather, my father, and I guess, I don't know how many decoys it's made, but it must run into the thousands, I guess. I know I've made hundreds with it, and I know my father made hundreds with it, and I can't remember my grandfather, but he no doubt made that many more too. They're pretty distinctive, I guess, because pretty near anybody can tell a Reeves decoy when they see it, and they're usually right, or they bring one to me and ask me, and they're usually right. Some of them I'm a little doubtful about, particularly in our family. Between my father and my Uncle Frank, made them together quite often, they worked together. And it's hard to tell one from the other there. No, my Uncle Frank head were a little bit different. You can usually tell his by the bill. That's about the only difference. Sometimes maybe my father made that body, but I know the head was made by Frank. So, but I know that they all came out of the same old shop and everything.
Many were lost when Lake Erie's frequent storms and high waters flooded the marshes and caused damage to the Long Point Company buildings where the decoys were stored.
There was hardly no change up until '73. Then the water kept coming. Oh, yeah. And we had very bad storms. Most of the damage is done in the wintertime or the springtime with ice. It took all the buildings out where that new house is built just the other side there. And there was the remains of a boathouse there. It had really good decoys. They were Phineas Reeve type decoys. They were all his decoys.
Perhaps somewhere in the cattails of the marsh, or maybe buried under wind-blown and ever-shifting beach sands, there are indeed some fine old decoys, casualties of high winds and rough waters. And maybe, too, as the storms come and go, a few will turn up. After the last big storm, Buck Walmsley took steps to preserve those that were still here.
We just pooled what was left. That's all the decoys we have. Some of the members have decoys in their houses that didn't get damaged, but all the decoys that we have now that we use out of this boathouse are what's just left. No, we tried plastic. We've tried foam ones too, but there is still nothing like the block.
Nothing like the block. 100 years ago and more, there were people carving wooden blocks all over North America. There were even factories which mass-produced excellent blocks. There's an honor roll of names like Shang Wheeler, Ward, Holmes, Davis, and Warren, Chambers, Wells, Burley, many more. And then there are the unknowns, mystery decoys, unsigned. Al Brady's roots as a carver of shooting decoys go back to a time when he hunted much more actively than he does today. There's now perhaps enough satisfaction for him in just seeing wild birds come to the decoys that he's carved.
This brings back a lot of pleasant memories. Great days spent with other people shooting, and the friendships that developed over it, and how I really got started in the carving business. Wanted the independence of my own decoys, and I look around, and 35 years or more later, how much has changed. There isn't the shooting done these days. certainly not using the same quantities of decoys, but I'm sure that the people who are hunting still enjoy it just as much, but perhaps because of bag limits, some of the thrill has gone out of it, and things change. So much has changed in the last 40 years. People are not making the decoys. We saw plastic decoys come, we saw plastic decoys go, and the return to wood, and more and more people making decoys for their own use and having lots of fun doing it.
His carvings are not the elaborately finished show birds. In competition circles, these are classified as shooting models, more like the best of the original decoys. Flat-bottomed, designed to ride naturally in the water, but with more detail. Books on decoy carving are popular with publishers. There's a mass of literature from which to choose, and most carvers and collectors have extensive libraries. It's a little like photography. Someone is always writing another book on the subject.
It's amazing the number of reference books that are available now, not only to the advanced carver, but to the beginner. Helpful articles. And I suppose if you really wanted to, you could spend a king's ransom buying books, but there are, I guess it's like milk and cream. The good ones always come to the top, and there's probably about 4 or 5 at the top of the list. Books on carving, books on painting. The thing they stress more than anything else is the confidence, and they want you just to, and they make it quite clear, just get in and do it. And if the decoy doesn't turn out exactly the way you think it should, well, then start all over again.
Somewhere in that block of basswood, there's a Canada goose.
The feeling when you commence the carving is anticipation and curiosity, particularly if you've never done that carving before. You're going to be awfully interested to see what it looks like. And then there's a great feeling of accomplishment. And I think in a society where we're so used to pushing buttons and having things done for us, it's nice to be able to say, I accomplished this myself. I made it. Canada goose is a very special bird. I think people get a tremendous feeling of strength and durability for a bird that's able to fly from the Arctic to the Gulf states to winter. The mother-father image with the goslings in the spring, it's just an amazing bird. And sometimes it's very difficult to say, what is so fascinating and what keeps bringing you back and say, I'd like to carve another Canada goose. And somebody says, well, you just carved 4, but you get drawn back. You want to carve another, thinking that it's going to be better than the last one. And sometimes they are better than the last one. And to get them to look lifelike is something that I guess we're always looking for. I often think, as prolific as they were, what could the carvers of 75 years ago done with the very sophisticated equipment that we use today? A little 1/10 horsepower motor and a flexible shaft and a rotary rasp that just chews the wood off at a great rate. They made simplistic shapes that were really very graceful and very exciting. The draw knife was a very popular tool. Files, and they turned out decoy after decoy after decoy. You know, a lot of good decoys, 75, 80 years old, have left this country and gone south of the border. It's a shame in one way that they couldn't have stayed here, and there couldn't have been more recognition afforded to these people. But there are other people coming along and taking up the slack and putting birds back in the market. We have some great Canadian carvers. We don't have to take a backseat to anybody. We're doing some great work in this country. More and more people are teaching, more and more people are learning, even if it's only a hobby, and then even if they don't become the world's greatest carvers, their awareness and their appreciation of the decoy business and shape and color and paint is enhanced and sharpened, and I think it's just good for the trade all the way around.
If the original historic decoys are migrating into the homes of collectors all over the continent, then maybe some of these birds will be the carving sought after by tomorrow's generations. Al Brady's teaching a course here at the Halliburton School of Fine Arts for people of all ages. Most of us have a desire to create something in our lives, to work with our hands and see whether we have skills just waiting to be developed. That's how it is in classes like this, where you have to be both carver and painter. Overcome a few frustrating failures at first, and then with perseverance and a growing talent and some quiet guidance, a bird begins to take shape in your hands. This form of folk art, carving wooden birds, has a relatively short history. Settlers wanted to shoot ducks, so they made decoys. Those who took pride in their work gave their birds a distinctive style. Years later, their decoys would be recognized and collected and studied by a new generation of carvers.
Everyone has a particular style, and if you're in this business long enough, it doesn't take very long, and you're able to look at a bird and say, ah, I know that carver, because you know what his little idiosyncrasies are, the way he does a burn on the head, how he carves a mandible separation and a bill. These things are all trademarks, and you can tell, it doesn't take very much, you can tell at a glance who's done a carving. Well, if you were shooting with a couple of dozen of these, the weight would just be unbearable, you know, to handle them in the morning, to put them in the boat and take them out to the hide or the water, wherever you were shooting, then put them all out, and then to gather them in at night. And you might be using 100 decoys in total, so if you cut down some weight, it made an appreciable difference. Plus the fact that they were a little more buoyant when they were hollow, and they floated much more lifelike. Not much remains now. The basic shape has been completed. We simply need a small block here to bring the top of the head up to the prescribed height from the bottom of the body. And that's shaped and blended into the breast and into the bottom of the neck. And from that point on, then we start to define and lay out with pencil on the sanded block the position of the primaries that are crossed, the tertials that cover the primaries at the back. Here are the flank feathers here, side feathers here, wing coverts on the top, There's a little depression here that separates the back from the, or the wings at least, from the side. The feathers, each individual feather will be drawn on in pencil and then cut out and then animated or textured with a combination of probably aluminum oxide disc and a burning pen.
That's the burning pen and a rotary rasp, two tools unknown to the decoy carver of the last century.
Probably the big change came certainly from a quantity standpoint and a quality standpoint after market gunning was concluded and the quantity of decoys lessened. Then they began to worry more about embellishing the birds. Competitions became available. There was a good deal of rivalry, and some of the old market hunters and gunners who made a living shooting waterfowl turned their talents to competitions. You must have competition. It's the same as anything else in baseball or hockey. I think you become horribly self-centered and say, if you didn't have the competition, I've carved the greatest drake wood ducks in the world, but when the competition comes along, someone else may form a different attitude, particularly a judge in a show. So I think you must have competition. I think, and there's a great camaraderie between the carvers. They support each other. It's not like a fisherman, perhaps, with a well-guarded secret that won't tell even his best friends where the good fishing hole is. The carvers unite, and there's always a great exchange of ideas. They're good people. It's not a simple thing anymore, because to produce the quality of bird that's being used in competition today, a man or a woman must be a great, great carver, must be a great, great painter. You have to have those two areas of talent, for only because of the combination of both those talents can you produce great birds.
Even if you are both a great painter and a great carver, there's something else that has to come from deep within. It's the ability to give that bird life. These are no longer just silhouettes to lure a bird down from the sky. They're going into a marketplace where the buyers are increasingly selective and well-informed. So, while adhering to yesterday's traditions, the carver also must respond to the expectations of today's buyers. Wildlife art generally in Canada is in a category of its own. It's largely ignored by the big galleries, yet enormously popular with everyone else. A curious situation for a society so shaped by contact with its wildlife. Meanwhile, the major and enthusiastic support comes from the public, from gift shops specializing in Canadiana, from antique stores that recognize this link with our history, and from private collectors who so encourage today's carvers. It's enough to keep people like Al Brady carving full-time. For him, it started as a hobby which grew and grew until one day he made the break. He quit his job and became a professional carver.
If people enjoy them in 100 years, that's fine. That's all I'm asking for, that they enjoy them and appreciate them. because I don't think things are going to happen, because the canvasback of 1922 is exactly the same as the canvasback of 1985. It's not like the automobile business. The models don't change. So, all things being equal, then, the canvasbacks in 75 or 100 years should be exactly the same as they are today. So people will know what they are.
His own shooting model carvings, and these are some of them, find a ready market, but not as decoys. They'll go on display in their owners' living rooms to be admired as descendants of the original folk art.
I think that this bird is finally ready to swim away. Let's see.
Today, collectors search hopefully at local auctions and decoy shows, looking for a bird by a famous carver from the last century, perhaps. A bird that somehow no one else has noticed. There are still stories of people finding them here and there, but the word is out among antique dealers and every old decoy is closely examined. Now there are buyers looking for antique decoys with hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend, and this has inflated prices to a new level. And yet, there are still basements and boathouses and garages across North America where valuable birds have been roosting for the last 60 or 70 years, and that too keeps the collectors searching. Thousands of birds which might have become valuable antiques were thrown away or burned when market gunning finally ended in 1918. Most of the rich marshes of the Great Lakes are gone now, buried under concrete or cornfields. What is now the Toronto waterfront was once a stopover for immense flocks of migrating waterfowl and shorebirds. And for more than 100 years, decoys were carved right here for hunters and market gunners. Now there's manicured grass and man-made lagoons and friendly Canada geese. But the old decoys do keep emerging from dusty basements, and no one knows this better than Patsy Fleming. Among her local discoveries was this unique Canadian collection of shorebirds.
Gosh, I wish I had a whole bunch of kids here to do this.
With her husband, Bob, she's setting them out in a natural setting in order to photograph them.
That's really... It's going pretty well. Yeah.
Does it look all right?
How do you think they look?
There are 8 species here in little groups. Black-bellied plovers, ruddy turnstones, knots, dunlins, yellowlegs, sanderlings, and curlews.
Oops. Does that look too...
Patsy Fleming feels that at least some of these birds should stay together, perhaps on public display, rather than scattering into auctions all over the continent. She is researching and writing a major book on Canadian decoys and their carvers, a project that has filled her home with books and photographs and maps and old documents. And she comes by her interest and knowledge as a result of first-hand experience.
I was in Kingston and going shooting with my father. He set out the decoys, and I was about 12, and I carried his bags for him. It's a terrible job for a kid, but it was that was really when I first understood a little bit about shooting. Those were the old wooden decoys. We set them in the marshes, and I very much enjoyed it. It was great to see how they were put out in those early days of shooting. I think folk art has evolved from hunting. It is first you need to produce food for your family, then you want the instruments to produce the food, and decoys, of course, come from that. When plastic was discovered, then of course all the fellows could buy plastic decoys much more easily than they could wood, and they were lighter to carry. And the wooden decoys became very valuable as antiques. So they were being moving out of Canada, out of Montreal and Quebec and Ontario by the truckloads. And when you realize that, you think, gosh, some of the early guys had real art in their hands. Some of the decoys were beautiful. And we didn't know who did them or what they were like or what the names of the people were. And I decided I would really do some work on researching and trying to discover this. I realized that if I was going to try and put together any kind of documentary work, it would involve traveling a bit, and it would involve gasoline, photography. I knew I couldn't afford to buy a lot of decoys, but I could do photography. So I thought to myself, who else is interested in this? Of course, the Canada Council came to my mind, and I thought, well, if they could help me, perhaps I could do this for the National Museums and for a good record of Canadian decoys. So I started that way, and I received the grant. It was great, a great surprise to me, and it was fabulous to have it. First, you have to discover where the decoys are, and of course, Prince Edward County, for instance, absolutely fabulous marshes, great shooting. The people that made decoys there really knew their ducks and made simply lovely decoys. So you go there, you find some old 80-year-old fellow who can tell you about the early days and who can identify the different decoys. Every farmer made decoys. Some of them were just blocks of wood, but some of them had just fabulous design, and some of the early decoys are absolutely fabulous. You see the work of this man, George Warren, out of Toronto. He was born in 1803. There's a picture of him. But his decoys are just fabulous. These are now sold for, these are probably the most expensive decoys in Canada. They're sold for $12,000 in that area. Started only about 4 years ago, they were selling for $4,000, $5,000. Now they've jumped in price and in value and in rarity. But that doesn't mean that you still today can't find a Warren that is maybe a bit broken, battered, shows its use or shows its age, and yet it's not too expensive. And that is still possible in Canada. That's part of the fun of collecting.
Her search for families that carved birds like these took her into archives and libraries and to old maps that show where the marshes once were.
Now this is a picture of Toronto Harbor, and this is 1909. And you can see this is the harbor as we know today, but all this was marshland in Ashbridges Bay. There were 9 miles of it, and this little strip of land was a sandy bar called Fisherman's Island, and there were cottages on it, and the shorebird shooting was absolutely terrific. One of the most exciting things that happened to me, I was in the east end of Toronto, and I'd been asked to go and see an older gentleman, and somebody had said, he's got something that he might like to show you. So I went to his house, and it had been a house that had been in his family for 3 generations. He went to the cellar, and he brought out shorebirds. And these were the very first shorebirds that we knew about in Toronto. No one, I don't think on this continent, realized that there was a real tradition of shorebird shooting in central Canada. We knew about the shorebird shooting in Nova Scotia, but in central Canada, nobody knew. It was forbidden by law to shoot shorebirds after 1920. So it's a long time back, and what do you know about it?
Word of this little collection has already traveled swiftly. These birds date back at least to 1918, some of them back beyond the turn of the century. This is one Canadian collection. There's nothing like it anywhere.
This kind of shooting finished in 1918 when the Migratory Bird Act was passed. So by 1920, that was the end of it. So they were in their baskets and stayed there until we discovered them in the early 1980s.
What was it like finding all these boxes?
You can't believe it. It was just fabulous. Basket after basket, all covered with 50 years of dirt. And when they were washed, it was like jewels. You know, the colors are absolutely lovely. It's very exciting and really a wonderful thing to find them. I feel this is really a Canadian heritage. These are Canadian heritage items, or what would you call them? Artifacts, really. This is unique for Canada. Last February, there was a shorebird decoy that was sold in the United States, and you can see it here, 50,000. Now, in Canada, we haven't quite got to that. This man was well established, his birds are well known, and have been for 20 years. In the United States, they're a lot farther ahead in the documenting of the whole decoy world, but that was a fabulous price, the highest that's ever been paid. And I don't think that, who knows, our shorebirds is more turn up, maybe in that bracket. But so far, we're just establishing the field, and people are just beginning to understand what treasures we do have in the early birds of Canada.
Curlews, plovers, sandpipers by the hundreds of thousands. They're gone now from places like this. These few wooden birds have returned to remind us of how it once was here, before the gun, the plow, and the bulldozer. It has been said that the wildfowl decoy was one of the last of our folk arts to be recognized. And that's why they're still showing up from old, forgotten hiding places. So for collectors who travel eagerly to auctions, there's always a feeling of anticipation. Some auction houses handle only decoys. The rising value of these birds that are so carefully described in auction catalogs reflects their status today as an investment, like oil paintings or rare books or real estate.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have an interesting collection of old decoys, handmade. These are from an estate down in the Kingston area along the St. Lawrence River. Here's an average item right there. Hand-carved decoy, anyone say about $40 for that one? $40. 10 is bid on it, who'll make it 15? Shall we say $15 on the left and now 20? 20 on the right and 25. $25, anyone else at 25 in the light coat, now 30, shall we say $30 and 35. $35. The bid standing at 30 and 35, two hands went up. I have the light coat. Would you make it 40, sir, on this side? $40 and 45. They were quite popular, and it was quite an art, I guess, years ago. And I think people threw a lot of them away, like a lot of other antique collectibles today. 52.50, take one more look at 50 and 52 and a half and 55. 55 I have and 57 and a half, sir. Back to you at 57.50. 57 and a half, and sold at $55. Oh, I've heard of people buying a summer cottage, and first thing they did was clean out the garage, and there'd be a couple of hundred of them. People had hundreds of them originally. This is a little smaller type. You'll see all styles here today. American style, shall we say $75 for the little one? I have 75 to open. Thank you very much. We'll make it 85. $85 and 95 in this corner. Now a $100 bill in the middle, and the back row, and 105. 105 and on this side, now 110. Shall we say 110 and 115? I don't think very many of them go back out in the water. I think they're collected and put on a mantle or a fireplace, something of that kind. It's nice. They're very nice, a few of them, you know, around a fireplace. It's very cozy. $325 and $350. We're just starting to realize what we're selling here. $350. I have it in $375. I have $380. Thank you. Now $390. $400 is bid. $410. Do I hear $410? $410. $410. $420 down here. So thank you. Now $430. $430. Fair warning at $420. And sold $420. The gentleman on the corner at $662. That's a dandy. There's one in Florida, I believe, that has one every year, and there's another one in the New England area. I got a flyer from them once when I wasn't able to go, but it sounded very interesting. It was all decoys, nothing else, water birds. $90 and 92 and a half. Would you go 92 and a half? So now 5. 95. Yes, 7 and a half. 97 and a half, and $100 bill to start it. 100 here, make it 110. 110. Any further bidding? Would you go 15? 105, bids in at 100. You have the bid, sir, and you bought it, sir. The $100 bill, 470 is the buyer. Any auction, you're selling a lifetime collection, someone that's gathered up, and a lot of it's irreplaceable. And it goes to the four winds, really, at an auction. A couple of hand-carved ducks, and I'll give you a little detail off the bottom here. These are called shooting models. Drake, canvasback, decoys, hand-carved, solid pine, carved and signed by Al Brady. This is the male and the female, and they should stay together, of course, in that situation. So you're buying the pair so much each, and I'd like 500 apiece for them. Would anyone start me off at 100 apiece? $100 each, shall we say 200? 150, 200 here, and 2.5. 250 from the lady, now 300, shall we say, and 3.5 and 4. 400 each and 450. You're buying the pair, 4.5 down front and 475. Anyone say 475, a new bidder now 500? It's interesting that they're still making them. A fellow like Al Brady's still producing them. It's a great thing to pass on to the next generation. Quite a pair. Take one more look at them. 1175 each. You're buying the two, and 1,200 each. 1,200 apiece and 1,225. Shall we say the quarter now 1,225 apiece? 1,225. Thank you. 1,250. 1,250 apiece. The bid's against you, sir, over here. I'm asking you 1,250. I'll take 1,235, but no less. 1,235 each and 12.5. 1,250 apiece. And buy the pair, 1,250. Would you go 1,260, sir? 1,260, fair warning at 1,250 apiece, a beautiful pair, and sold right there for $2,500 the pair, $659 the buyer. Good luck with your purchase, ma'am.
These birds remain a symbol of our stewardship over the marshes and wetlands that they must have for survival. A message kept alive by the art of the wildfowler.